For 5 centuries, Alistair Montgomery, the last pure-blood sovereign, rejected the world's most powerful women. They offered emperors and ancient bloodlines. He showed them the door. He was waiting for a soul he hadn't felt since 1523. But the woman who would finally break his curse didn't have a voice at all. Hidden deep within the mist-shrouded peaks of the Hudson Valley sits the Rosecliff Estate, a sprawling Gothic manor that doesn't exist on any modern map. The locals whisper about the Montgomery family, a lineage of reclusive billionaires whose wealth seemingly funded the Industrial Revolution, bailed out the Astors during the Panic of 1907, and silently controlled the private banking sectors of Europe. But the truth was far darker and infinitely more ancient. Alistair Montgomery was not just a billionaire tech magnate or a reclusive aristocratic heir. He was a vampire king. For exactly 500 years, Alistair had sat on a hidden throne of shadow and silk, ruling over a fractured underworld that demanded only one thing from him: an heir. Every decade, the ritual of the selection was held. It was a fiercely guarded secret among the global elite. Daughters of the world's most powerful families, the DuPonts, the Sinclairs, the hidden royal houses of Eastern Europe, were brought to Rosecliff. They came draped in diamonds and armed with lethal ambition, offering their blood, their loyalty, and their bodies to the immortal sovereign. And for 500 years, Alistair had rejected every single one of them. He didn't just reject them, he broke them. With a single glance, Alistair possessed the terrifying ability to hear the true intentions of anyone in his presence. When the beautiful heiress, Lady Victoria Cavendish, knelt before him in 1922, he didn't hear a vow of love. He heard her internal calculations on how quickly she could poison him to seize his assets. When the breathtaking Isabella Rossi offered her neck to him in 1985, he heard only the hollow, echoing vanity of a woman obsessed with eternal youth. Alistair was disgusted by the noise of human greed. The world was too loud, too selfish, too utterly predictable. His heart, frozen in his chest, had not beaten in centuries. He was preparing to end his own existence, exhausted by the endless parade of deceitful brides, when the estate hired a new wave of domestic staff for the upcoming 2024 Selection Gala. Among them was Clara Hayes. Clara was 23, with hair the color of roasted chestnuts and eyes like shattered storm clouds. She didn't come from money. She didn't belong to a secret society. She was a survivor. 10 years prior, a horrific car accident on a slick Pennsylvania highway had claimed the lives of both her parents. The trauma of being trapped in the wreckage for 2 days had stolen something else from Clara: her voice. She suffered from profound psychogenic mutism. She hadn't spoken a single word since she was 13 years old. To survive in a world that demanded noise, Clara had made herself invisible. She learned to walk without making a sound, to clean a room without disturbing the air, and to blend into the shadows of the grand houses she worked in. The Rosecliff estate paid an exorbitant salary to its staff, provided they signed airtight non-disclosure agreements and never looked the master of the house in the eye. For Clara, this was paradise. She preferred the silence. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, just 3 days before the selection gala. The manor was a frenzy of preparation. Thousands of white roses were being imported from Ecuador. Crystal chandeliers were being polished by a small army of maids. Clara had been assigned to clean the West Wing library, a forbidden zone usually, but the head housekeeper was desperate. The library was a cavernous room, smelling of aged parchment and old leather. Clara moved through it like a ghost, her feather duster tracing the spines of first-edition Shakespeare and Galileo manuscripts. She was completely at peace, humming a silent melody in her mind, a coping mechanism she used to organize her thoughts. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. The heavy oak doors hadn't opened, but the atmosphere shifted, growing thick and suffocatingly tense. Alistair Montgomery stood in the archway. He was devastatingly handsome, with sharp, aristocratic features, raven black hair, and eyes the color of bruised violets. He wore a simple tailored suit, but he carried the predatory grace of a starving wolf. He had retreated to the library to escape the agonizing mental noise of the arriving brides, whose thoughts were already echoing through the lower floors like a swarm of ravenous locusts. Alistair closed his eyes, bracing himself for the inevitable flood of terrified or greedy thoughts from the maid he sensed in the room. He reached out with his mind, preparing to erase her memory of him and dismiss her. But when his telepathy brushed against Clara's mind, Alistair staggered backward, actually gripping the doorframe for support. There was no noise. No frantic scrambling of anxiety, no calculations of wealth or fear of his imposing presence. Instead, Alistair heard a symphony. Because Clara couldn't speak, her internal world was a vibrant, sprawling canvas of sensory imagination. Alistair didn't hear words. He felt the gentle, rhythmic hum of a cello playing a melancholy tune. He saw vivid bursts of color, the exact shade of the autumn leaves outside, the tactile memory of the leather books she was dusting. It was the most beautiful, purest mental sanctuary he had encountered in half a millennium. Clara turned around, noticing him for the first time. She didn't gasp. She didn't drop her duster. She simply stood there, her wide, stormy eyes locking onto his violet ones. She gave a small, respectful curtsy, keeping her gaze steady. "Who are you?" Alistair projected the thought directly into her mind, a trick that usually sent humans screaming in terror. Clara blinked, mildly surprised, but she didn't panic. Her mind simply formed a gentle, inquisitive image, a picture of a small brown field mouse looking up at a towering dark storm cloud. For the first time in 500 years, Alistair Montgomery smiled. The obsession was instantaneous and absolute. Over the next 2 days, Alistair rearranged the entire structure of his household just to keep Clara near him. He promoted her from general housekeeping to his personal attendant, a position that hadn't been filled since the 1800s. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, was visibly terrified by the command, but she obeyed without question. Clara found herself serving tea in his private study, organizing his correspondences, and standing quietly in the corner while he conducted ruthless business meetings with global politicians and tech CEOs. She was entirely unaware of what he was. She simply thought her boss was an eccentric, incredibly intense billionaire who preferred a quiet assistant. But for Alistair, Clara was an oasis in a desert of torment. When the psychic noise of the estate became too much, when the scheming thoughts of the arriving aristocratic brides gave him blinding migraines, he would summon Clara. He would sit in his leather armchair, close his eyes, and just listen to the profound, beautiful quiet of her mind. She thought in feelings, in colors, in memories of rain tapping against a window pane. She was pure. She was entirely untainted by the darkness of his world. However, the peace could not last. The selection gala had arrived. The grand ballroom of Rosecliff Estate was transformed into a glittering spectacle of wealth and power. Orchestras played, champagne flowed, and the world's most elite vampire families mingled with human billionaires who were desperate for immortal favors. At the center of it all was Genevieve Sinclair. Genevieve was the front-runner for the throne. Her family controlled the largest private blood banks in Northern Europe. She was breathtakingly beautiful, with icy blonde hair and a smile that could freeze water. She had spent the last 50 years preparing to be Alistair's queen, and she was fiercely territorial. As the night wore on, Alistair sat on a raised velvet dais, looking thoroughly bored as bride after bride was presented to him. He could hear their minds. "I will finally have his wealth," thought a Russian countess. "I will control the North American covens," plotted a French heiress. Standing in the shadows behind a massive marble pillar, holding a silver tray of fresh crystal glasses, was Clara. She was wearing a simple conservative black uniform, completely out of place among the silken diamonds. She watched the lavish display with mild curiosity, her mind occupied by the fascinating way the chandelier light fractured into rainbows on the polished floor. Alistair, completely ignoring the beautiful Genevieve, who was mid-conversation with him, kept glancing past her shoulder toward the pillar. He was actively tuning out Genevieve's voice, choosing instead to bathe in the soothing, quiet colors of Clara's thoughts. Genevieve, possessing the sharp instincts of a predator, noticed his distraction. She tracked his gaze and spotted the mundane, invisible human maid in the corner. Insulted and enraged, Genevieve decided to make an example of the girl. "Excuse me, Alistair, darling," Genevieve purred, turning away from the dais and marching straight toward Clara. The crowd parted for her, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Clara, realizing she was being approached, lowered her head subserviently and offered the tray of glasses. Genevieve didn't take a glass. Instead, with a cruel, lightning-fast flick of her wrist, she slapped the silver tray entirely out of Clara's hands. The heavy crystal glasses shattered violently against the marble floor, the sharp sound echoing through the suddenly silent ballroom. "You clumsy, pathetic creature," Genevieve hissed loudly, ensuring the entire room could hear. "Look what you've done. Clean it up. Use your hands." Clara dropped to her knees immediately. She was trembling, but her face remained a mask of stoic calm. She reached out to gather the jagged shards of crystal. Genevieve sneered, lifting the heel of her designer stiletto, intending to step directly onto Clara's bare hand as she picked up the glass. But Genevieve's foot never made contact. A force like a localized hurricane ripped through the ballroom. The heavy oak doors slammed shut violently, shattering their frames. The crystal chandeliers flickered and died, plunging the room into an eerie, unnatural twilight. In a fraction of a second, Alistair was no longer on his throne. He was standing directly in front of Clara, his hand wrapped tightly around Genevieve's throat, holding the immortal heiress a full foot off the ground. The room erupted into panicked gasps, but no one dared move. Alistair's eyes were no longer violet. They were a glowing, terrifying crimson. The veins under his pale skin ran black with fury. He didn't yell. When he spoke, his voice was a deadly, rumbling whisper that vibrated in the chest of every person in the room. "If you ever look at her again," Alistair said to the gasping, choking Genevieve, "I will rip your heart out through your spine and feed it to the hounds." He tossed Genevieve aside like a broken doll. She crashed into a champagne tower, covered in glass and expensive wine, utterly humiliated. Alistair turned his back on the wealthiest, most powerful vampires in the world. He knelt down on the floor, ignoring the shards of crystal that bit into his expensive trousers. He gently took Clara's trembling hands in his own, pulling her away from the broken glass. "Are you hurt?" His voice echoed softly in her mind, completely devoid of the monstrous rage he had just displayed. Clara stared at him, her chest heaving. For the first time, she truly looked at what he was. She saw the slightly elongated canines, the unnatural speed, the glowing red of his eyes fading back to violet. But miraculously, her mind didn't flood with terror. It flooded with something much more dangerous. Compassion. In Alistair's mind, he felt Clara's response. It was an image of a fierce, protective lion standing guard over a small, wounded bird. It was a feeling of profound, unconditional gratitude. Without a word, Alistair stood up, pulling Clara up with him. He looked out at the sea of shocked aristocrats, the 500 years of bloodlines, wealth, and power that had tried to claim him. "The selection is over," Alistair announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "Get out of my house." He turned and walked out of the ballroom, keeping Clara's hand tightly encased in his. He didn't care about the political fallout. He didn't care that he had just declared war on the Sinclair family. He only cared about the silent woman walking beside him. But as they disappeared into the dark corridors of the manor, Genevieve Sinclair pulled herself from the wreckage of the Champagne Tower. Her eyes burned with a venomous, murderous hatred. The Vampire King had rejected them all for a broken, mute human. And Genevieve swore to the ancient gods of their kind that she would ensure Clara Hayes never left Rosecliff Estate alive. The morning after the catastrophic selection gala, the financial markets of the human world experienced an inexplicable tremor. Trillions of dollars shifted across offshore accounts. Stocks in Sinclair Pharmaceuticals plummeted, while Montgomery Holdings absorbed staggering losses in the European real estate sector. To the oblivious human anchors on CNN and Bloomberg, it was a sudden, aggressive corporate war. To the hidden elite, it was a declaration of supernatural annihilation. Inside the impenetrable walls of the Rosecliff Estate, the atmosphere was suffocating. Alistair had moved Clara into the master wing, a sprawling suite of mahogany, velvet, and bulletproof glass overlooking the Hudson River. For the first time in her life, Clara was not serving. She was being served. However, she refused the silk gowns and diamond-encrusted jewelry Alistair's remaining staff tried to offer her. She requested only a simple cashmere sweater and a pair of denim jeans. Alistair spent the next 48 hours pacing the length of his vast study, coordinating a brutal defense against the Sinclair family's retaliation. The Sinclairs weren't just wealthy. They used the highly secretive Bilderberg Group meetings as a front to dictate global blood trafficking routes. Genevieve's father, Lord Arthur Sinclair, owned half the private politicians in Washington and London. They were assembling a mercenary strike force of rogue vampires, heavily armed human contractors, and corrupt federal agents to raid Rosecliff. Yet whenever Alistair felt the ancient, monstrous rage rising in his chest, he would retreat to Clara's room. He found her sitting on the balcony floor that afternoon, sketching the storm clouds gathering over the valley. Alistair sat beside her, his tailored Briony suit contrasting sharply with the raw stone. He didn't speak aloud. He didn't have to. "I owe you an explanation," his voice murmured gently in her mind. Clara looked up, her pencil pausing. Her mind projected some open meadow, a sign that she was listening, completely devoid of fear. Alistair looked out at the darkening sky, the weight of 5 centuries pressing down on his shoulders. "I was not born a monster, Clara. I was human once, a minor lord in Florence during the Italian Renaissance. In 1523, a plague swept through our city. It wasn't a disease. It was a coven. They slaughtered my family, but the coven leader, a creature of pure sadism, decided my punishment for fighting back would be immortality. He turned me, forcing me to watch everyone I loved wither and die while I remained frozen." He turned to look at her, his violet eyes swirling with an ancient sorrow. "I spent the next 200 years hunting him down, and the next 300 amassing enough wealth and power to ensure no coven could ever dictate my existence again. But the curse of my bloodline is isolation. My telepathy makes it impossible to endure the company of others. I hear every lie, every greedy ambition, every dark impulse of the human and immortal soul. It is a deafening, agonizing roar. Until I met you. Clara reached out, her warm, fragile fingers tracing the cold, marble-like skin of his jaw. In her mind, she didn't offer pity. Pity was useless. Instead, she offered a profound, overwhelming sense of acceptance. She showed him a mental image of a dark, abandoned fortress, finally opening its gates to the sunlight. For the first time since 1523, Alistair felt a tear break the surface of his eye. He leaned into her touch, completely disarmed by the silent maid who possessed more strength than 1,000 immortal kings. But their fragile sanctuary was about to be violently shattered. At exactly midnight, the perimeter alarms of Rosecliff Estate went dead. There was no siren, no warning, just the sudden, chilling silence of a severed power grid. Alistair's head snapped up. His telepathy, usually reaching for miles, was suddenly blocked by a localized electromagnetic frequency jammer, a military-grade device exclusively manufactured by a Sinclair subsidiary. "They are here," Alistair projected into Clara's mind, his demeanor shifting instantly from a vulnerable lover to an apex predator. "Stay in this room. The glass is reinforced. Do not open the door for anyone but me." Before Clara could nod, Alistair vanished, nothing but a blur of shadow leaving the room. Downstairs, the grand foyer had become a slaughterhouse. Dozens of heavily armed mercenaries, equipped with UV-laced incendiary rounds, breached the mahogany doors. Accompanying them were 5 Sinclair enforcers, lethal, ancient vampires hired specifically to restrain Alistair. Alistair descended upon them like an avenging god. He didn't use weapons. He was the weapon. He moved faster than the human eye could track, snapping necks and tearing through titanium body armor with his bare hands. The foyer was painted in blood and the flash of gunfire. But it was a distraction. While Alistair systematically dismantled the strike team on the ground floor, Genevieve Sinclair had already bypassed the main house. She had coerced Rosecliff's head of security, a human named Miller who had massive hidden gambling debts tied to the real-world Genovese crime family, to give her the master bypass codes to the upper wings. Clara was standing near the fireplace, clutching a heavy iron poker, her heart hammering against her ribs. The reinforced doors of the master suite didn't blast open. They simply clicked, the electronic lock glowing green as it was overridden. Genevieve stepped into the room. She was dressed in sleek, black tactical leather, her blonde hair pulled back, her fangs fully extended. She looked at Clara and smiled, a terrifying, soulless expression. "Did you really think," Genevieve purred, stepping over the threshold, "that a mute little human could steal the throne from a Sinclair and live to see the weekend?" Clara didn't back away. She gripped the iron poker tighter, her knuckles turning white. She couldn't scream for help, but even if she could, the raging battle downstairs drowned out all other noise. "He's distracted," Genevieve sneered, slowly circling Clara like a cat playing with an injured mouse. "My father sent 50 men to die downstairs just to buy me 3 minutes with you. You ruined my destiny, you little rat. You humiliated me in front of the syndicate." Clara swung the heavy iron poker with all the strength she possessed. It was a fast, desperate strike, aimed directly at Genevieve's head. But human speed was nothing to a vampire. Genevieve caught the iron rod with one hand, her expression turning bored. With a violent twist, she ripped it from Clara's grasp and threw it across the room, where it shattered a priceless Ming vase. Before Clara could react, Genevieve's hand shot out, her fingers wrapping around Clara's throat. She lifted the human girl off the ground, pinning her against the silk-lined wall. Clara choked, her hands desperately clawing at Genevieve's iron grip. Black spots began to dance in her vision. "I'm going to drain you dry," Genevieve whispered, her breath cold against Clara's cheek. "And when Alistair comes back, I'm going to make him watch me burn your lifeless body to ashes." Genevieve lunged forward, her fangs sinking deeply into the soft flesh of Clara's neck. Pain, sharp and blinding, exploded through Clara's nervous system. She could feel her life force, her very heartbeat, being violently pulled from her veins. Her mind, usually a quiet sanctuary of colors and music, erupted into a chaotic, terrifying storm of static and fading light. 2 floors below, Alistair had just ripped the heart from the chest of the final Sinclair enforcer. He was drenched in blood, his chest heaving, when a psychic shockwave hit him. It wasn't a thought. It was the sudden, horrifying sensation of Clara's mental symphony being silenced. A monstrous, unholy roar ripped from Alistair's throat. The sound shattered every remaining window on the ground floor. He didn't run up the stairs. He launched himself straight up through the architecture, crashing through the ceiling of the foyer and bursting through the hardwood floor of the master suite. He arrived in a shower of splintered wood and plaster. Genevieve dropped Clara in shock, spinning around just as Alistair collided with her. The impact was like a freight train. Alistair tackled Genevieve through the bulletproof glass of the balcony, the reinforced panes shattering outward into the night sky. They crashed onto the stone terrace, grappling in a blur of supernatural violence. Genevieve fought with the desperation of a cornered animal, but she was no match for a 500-year-old sovereign fueled by pure, unadulterated grief. Alistair didn't hesitate. He grabbed Genevieve by her blonde hair, forced her to her knees, and with one brutal, decisive motion, severed her head from her shoulders. The Sinclair heiress crumbled into a pile of grey ash, scattering into the autumn wind. Alistair didn't pause to watch her burn. He sprinted back into the ruined bedroom, dropping to his knees beside Clara. She was lying on the floor, her skin horrifyingly pale, a pool of dark crimson spreading beneath her neck. Her eyes were half open, staring blankly at the ceiling. The psychic link between them was terrifyingly faint, just a dying ember in the dark. "Clara," Alistair begged, his hands trembling as he pressed them against her wound to stop the bleeding. "Clara, look at me. Stay with me. Please." For 500 years, Alistair Montgomery had controlled empires. He had orchestrated wars, manipulated global economies, and commanded the fearsome creatures of the night. But kneeling on the floor, covered in blood, he was utterly powerless. He was just a man, watching the only light he had ever known extinguish. Clara's eyes flickered, finding his. In her mind, the grand, beautiful symphony she usually played for him was fading into a singular, desperate note of sorrow. She didn't want to leave him. She knew that without her, he would sink back into the deafening darkness, and this time, he wouldn't survive it. The psychological trauma that had locked her vocal cords for 10 years was a cage built on fear. But in this final moment, looking into the tear-filled eyes of the immortal king who loved her, that fear evaporated, replaced by an overwhelming, desperate need to comfort him. Clara reached up, her blood-stained fingers touching his cheek. Her lips parted. She drew a shallow, agonizing breath, fighting against a decade of silence, fighting against the encroaching grip of death. And then she spoke. Her voice was raw, raspy, and incredibly fragile, breaking the silence of the room like a crack of thunder. "Save me." Alistair froze, the sound of her physical voice hitting him with the force of a physical blow. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. "I will," Alistair swore, his eyes glowing with a fierce, brilliant crimson. "I am going to bring you into the dark, my love. But you will never be alone." Alistair bit into his own wrist, tearing the flesh until his immortal blood welled up, thick, dark, and pulsing with ancient power. He pressed his bleeding wrist to Clara's pale lips. "Drink," he commanded softly. Clara swallowed the blood. It tasted like copper and liquid fire. The moment it hit her bloodstream, her body convulsed. The transition from human to immortal is a brutally violent process, a war between life and death at a cellular level. Alistair pulled her into his lap, wrapping his arms around her tightly, rocking her as the fever consumed her. He stayed with her for 3 days and 3 nights, while her body burned and rebuilt itself. He ignored the frantic calls from the syndicate, ignored the fallout of Genevieve Sinclair's death. He only focused on the woman in his arms. On the evening of the 4th day, the storm broke. Clara opened her eyes. They were no longer the color of stormy grey clouds. They were a vibrant, mesmerizing shade of crimson that slowly faded into a deep, brilliant violet, the exact color of Alistair's. She took a deep breath, feeling the unnatural strength coiling in her muscles. The physical world was overwhelmingly loud now. She could hear the heartbeat of a deer miles away in the forest, the rustle of leaves falling to the ground. But when she looked at Alistair, sitting beside the bed, haggard and anxious, the noise faded. Alistair held his breath, terrified of what the transformation might have done to her mind. "Clara." He reached out telepathically, bracing for the dark, greedy noise that plagued all vampires. Instead, he was flooded with the triumphant, deafening roar of a grand orchestra, playing a crescendo of absolute joy. Her mind was still pure. The vampirism hadn't corrupted her soul. It had amplified its beauty. Clara sat up, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that belonged to a queen. She looked at Alistair, a soft, confident smile touching her lips. "I hear you," Clara said aloud, her voice clear and melodic. Alistair let out a breath he felt he had been holding for centuries. He pulled her into a desperate, passionate kiss, a promise sealed in blood and shadows. The world of the elite vampires would never be the same. The Sinclair family demanded a war. But when Alistair Montgomery emerged from the Rosecliff estate a week later, he did not come alone. Clara stood beside him, no longer an invisible maid, but a sovereign queen, possessing a psychic dominance that brought the oldest vampires to their knees. For 500 years, the Vampire King had waited in the deafening noise of the world. Now he ruled it, guided by the woman whose silence had saved his soul and whose voice would echo through eternity. Did Clara and Alistair's dark romance keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved this thrilling twist on the Vampire King trope, smash that like button and share this video with your fellow dark romance lovers. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our spine-chilling, epic love stories. Drop a comment below. What power would you want as a vampire? See you in the next story.